Hello, everyone. This is what I'll be calling a second look video. That is, after we go through the reading for a week and do our assignments, and I'll be taking a second look at the reading the week after. As I said in an earlier video, this is mostly for the sake of, for its own sake, because we want to gain as much understanding of these readings as we can, but also kind of storing up videos for an exam review at the end of the class. A second look, not a definitive look. That is, I'm not dictating what these texts actually mean. I think if you do a credible job in the assignment, where you lay out what you believe to be the argument of the essay and do a critique of it, that's fine, as long as it's credible, as long as it's based upon the text and well done. It doesn't have to exactly agree with my own take on what the reading is. But I thought that, again, since we will be doing an exam on it, that is based upon more or less my take on these readings, that a video in which I lay out in a little more detail or a little more forthrightly what I take to be, in general terms, the argument of the text, and perhaps some a point here and there about what I think of the argument, that might help for the final exam. So let's take a look at, or a second look at, Russell's appearance in reality. I think that the key to getting a grasp of, beginning to get a grasp of what he's doing is that first line, which is a question: is there any knowledge in the world which is so certain that no reasonable man could doubt it? That's a question, and a question I think he does actually follow up. Is there anything that we know for certain? And although I don't think, gives a definitive answer to that, he certainly means to show that the answer may be no. There is nothing that we know with absolute certainty. And it could be that. But he's certainly trying to sort of break down in his analysis our usual faith and assumption that we do know things for certain. And he starts out with our sense knowledge. That is, knowledge that we get through the senses. And although there's no real discussion of it, there are other sorts of knowledge. That is, that Russell does not believe that everything that we know comes through the senses. There are other things that we know that are not based upon sense knowledge. But that's not so important here. The importance is that, well, we do think that we know a lot of stuff based upon the evidence of our senses, and what he wants to show is that it's not so clear at all. And he starts out with his infamous, or just great example of the table and its color, and shows that a very simple question like, what is the color of this table, is not so simple at all. That the color of the table depends upon a lot of things. And the answer to the question, there may be no answer at all, is what he says, because the color of the table depends upon the viewer and the conditions under which it's seen. So that he is, at the end of this, driven to say here, but the other colors which appear under other conditions have just as good a right to be considered real, and therefore, to avoid favoritism, we are compelled to deny that in itself the table has any one particular color. So this calls into question our whole idea of, things having a color. Things don't have a single color. Things have different colors depending upon the conditions under which they're viewed and the condition of the subject that views them. And then he goes into the same thing having to do with texture and shape, breaking down our usual confidence in these sort of judgments about the characteristics of physical objects. And he goes so far as to say, after reviewing these different, the questionableness, you might say, of our judgments about these things. He goes so far as to say on page 3, thus it becomes evident that the real table, if there is one, is not the same as what we immediately experience by sight or touch or hearing. That is, after analyzing the situation, after reflecting upon the situation, we realize that there is a distinction between what appears to us and what we presume to be real. Now, this brings all sorts of questions, but so he says the real table, if there is one, is not immediately known to us at all, but must be an inference from what is immediately known. So this leads us into some distinctions he makes here on the same page between what he calls sense data and sensation. That is, what do we immediately know in sense experience? Well, not the things that exist independently of us, that we presume without real evidence to exist independently of us. What we know are sense data, which is the immediate content of our sensations. So he makes this distinction between sensations on the one hand, which is the activity of sensing, and the content of those sensations, which he calls sense data. And data means given, what is given in sense experience, which sets up a certain theory of perception, which says that all we really know immediately, that is the true content of our sensations, are what he's calling sense data, which is something that is distinct from the physical object itself. We never know the physical object directly. As he says, it's an inference. It's a judgment we make based upon our direct experience of sense data. So, as he says at the end of that paragraph, thus a problem arises as to the relation of the sense data to the real table, supposing there is such a thing, which is the problem of skepticism. Skepticism with regard to the physical world. How do we know that there is a physical world at all if all we know directly are sense data? And this leads him into discussion of other philosophers. I would say most prominently a philosopher named Berkeley, an 18th century philosopher who I think he correctly characterizes as an idealist, in the sense that only ideas are real, as opposed to matter. Matter being the idea of something which is not mind, which is independent of us, and which constitutes the physical natural world, which is the normal view. But Russell has shown, as Berkeley tried to show, that this whole notion of a physical world composed of matter, of physical objects, which are distinct from our minds and external to us, is problematic. So he reviews some of the ideas of what matter is, and Berkeley, who's denied matter, basically has to account for our experience and does it in rather extravagant ways. The idea that, well, the real table is not a physical object, is not matter. It is an idea, and he says an idea in the mind of God, and this would account for why we all have access to the same table, or, when we look at a table and then we look away and then we look back, we say that it's the same table, even though we were not sensing it in the meantime. That what accounts for that it was an idea in the mind of God the whole time, so that would account for its persistence of being. And these are rather extravagant metaphysical theories, but the kind of thing that you're led into, I think, once you're led to the point in the problem that Russell is, where he makes this distinction between the physical object on the one hand and our sense data on the other, and the problem of connecting the two, which does, of course, lead either to, a complete skepticism, right? We can't know anything about the physical world, or other ideas like Berkeley's having to do with matter really being an idea in the mind of God. Uh, so again, led to this question. I guess this is at the bottom of page 4. The same question, or the same pair of questions: is there a real table at all? And if so, what sort of object can it be? I think that if we look at the little essay as a whole, and again, this is an introduction or the introductory chapter in a whole book in which he will maybe flesh out his own ideas. But what we're led to is a position where we realize that, at least in one respect, things that we thought we knew, upon further reflection, upon philosophical reflection, we realize that it may be that we know them. It may be that we do know them. And with regard to physical objects, Russell suggests that he does believe that there is a physical world independent of us, but he just suggests that. He doesn't offer any sort of argument for it. That we are led to this conclusion that our answer to the question is unresolved. Is there anything that we know with such certainty that no reasonable person could doubt it? Well, probably not. At least we've shown that some knowledge that we would have taken for granted before is actually highly questionable. Again, he goes on in the book to discuss other forms of knowledge. So is there a conclusion here? Well, in a certain way, we could there is an implied conclusion, and that is the answer to his opening question, which is maybe based upon this discussion here. No, there is no such thing that we know with absolute certainty. It may be that we know things, but we can't at this point at least be absolutely certain. Of course, there's another sort of conclusion here, and that is what he says at the end, where he says philosophy, if it cannot answer so many questions as we could wish, has at least the power of asking questions which increase the interest of the world. So that is another possible conclusion here. That is that what philosophy is showing us the questionableness of our assumptions about reality, and how there's this whole other dimension of questioning and reasoning and reflection and inquiry that we had no idea about. I would say that if one were to say that a big conclusion here is the questionableness of what we appear to know on the basis of our senses, I would say that if we were begin to critically evaluate Russell's argument, I would say that a huge issue here would be his distinction between, or his idea of sense data. Because what it does imply is that the content of our sense experience is basically our own minds rather than external objects. Let's just take a brief look at what he actually, when he introduces that idea, take a closer look at it. Again, this is on page 3, around the middle. It will help us in considering these questions to have a few simple terms of which the meaning is definite and clear. Now, is it so definite and clear? Let us give the name of sense data. And remember, data means given. That's the idea of it. Data is just things that are there. Sense data to the things that are immediately known in sensation. Immediately known, not known through anything else, but known directly. Such things as colors, sounds, smells, hardnesses, roughnesses, and so on. We shall give the name sensation to the experience. So sensation is not a sense data. Sense data is the content of a sensation. We shall give the name sensation to the experience of being immediately aware of these things. Thus, whenever we see a color, we have a sensation of color, but the color itself is a sense datum, not a sensation. The color is that of which we are immediately aware, and the awareness itself is the sensation. It is plain that if we are to know anything about the table, it must be by means of the sense data, brown color, oblong shape, smoothness, etc., which we associate with the table. But for the reasons which have been given, we cannot say that the table is the sense data, or even that the sense data are directly properties of the table. Thus, a problem arises as to the relation of the sense data to the real table, supposing there is such a thing. I suppose if I were to begin attacking or critiquing Russell's argument here, it would be in this idea of sense data, which is a rather vague idea. By sense data, does he mean something which is internal to us? Seemingly, but he didn't come out and say it. Is that a correct account of sense experience, that we have a sensation, but our sensations are about sense data rather than about the objects that are external to us? I think it's a rather questionable idea. I mean, it's interesting, but I think it's a rather questionable idea. That is, he's given me reasons to believe that it's true for sure, but I'd still wonder if, like, when I'm looking at the table that's in front of me, is the content, do I really want to say that the content of my experience is sense datum rather than the table itself? And that is something which Russell has been criticized by in the 20th century by other philosophers, that has problems of its own. So this is just a little review of the text. Again, I'm not dictating what the text definitively is, what you have to think of it, but I thought I'd do a little more in these about these texts, something a little bit more detailed than the initial video. Again, mostly for the purposes of thinking ahead to the final exam, but just because this is what we're doing in the class,